You are standing in the dense, freezing woods of the Ardennes forest. It is the morning of May 10th, 1940. For the past 8 months, you and your fellow French soldiers have been waiting. Britain and France declared war on Germany back in September, but the Western Front has been eerily quiet. Your commanders have assured you that this specific forest is completely impassable for heavy armor. You are safe, they say. Then, the ground begins to shake. The sound of snapping trees echoes through the morning mist. Suddenly, the impossible happens. The terrifying, flat gray hull of a German panzer tank bursts violently through the thick timber, followed by dozens, then hundreds more. Before you can even raise your rifle, the entire geopolitical structure of Western Europe is about to be physically shattered. Chapter 1. The Phony War and the Kinetic Spearhead. When we last left the timeline on September 3, 1939, the global pressure cooker had finally burst. Following the invasion of Poland, Britain and France declared war on Adolf Hitler. The world braced for an immediate apocalyptic clash, but instead, nothing happened. For 8 agonizing months, the West sat in a tense, surreal silence. Journalists dubbed it the Phony War, or the Blitzkrieg, the Sitting War. The French military felt secure behind the Maginot Line, a massive state-of-the-art wall of concrete fortresses and artillery stretching along the German border. But as French historian and soldier Marc Bloch later documented in his devastating memoir Strange Defeat, the French High Command suffered from a fatal intellectual failure. They were preparing to fight a slow defensive World War I. Germany was preparing to fight a war of pure kinetic energy. In physics, kinetic energy is the energy of mass in motion. If you take a massive amount of force and spread it out evenly against a wall, the wall holds. But if you take that exact same mass, concentrate it into a tiny high-speed point, and strike a vulnerable seam, the pressure doesn't just push the object, it shatters it. That was the Blitzkrieg. Hitler didn't attack the heavily fortified Maginot Line. He flowed around it. On May 10, 1940, German forces concentrated their elite panzer tank divisions into a single overwhelming spearhead and drove them straight through the Ardennes forest, the exact spot the Allies left lightly defended because they thought the terrain was too rough for tanks. The German armor punched a hole through the French lines at Sedan and raced at breakneck speed toward the English Channel. They completely severed the Allied supply lines and communication networks. The French army, widely considered one of the most powerful on the planet, mathematically collapsed under the sheer speed of the German advance. In just 6 weeks, the unthinkable became reality. Paris fell. France surrendered. Chapter 2. The Island Fortress. By the summer of 1940, the geopolitical map had been entirely rewritten. Hitler controlled the western coastline of Europe. Only one major obstacle stood between Nazi Germany and total, unchallenged dominance of the West, the island nation of Great Britain. With the British Expeditionary Force having narrowly escaped annihilation by evacuating across the Channel at Dunkirk, Britain was isolated, outgunned, and bracing for an imminent naval invasion. But to cross the English Channel, Hitler first needed absolute control of the sky. In July 1940, the Battle of Britain began. The German Luftwaffe launched massive bombing campaigns against British radar stations, airfields, and eventually, the City of London itself, a period of relentless nighttime bombing known as the Blitz. American journalist Edward R. Murrow stood on the rooftops of London during these raids, broadcasting the sound of falling bombs and air raid sirens live back to a stunned United States. His reporting vividly documented the sheer psychological terror inflicted on British civilians. But despite the overwhelming numbers of the Luftwaffe, the British Royal Air Force had a hidden structural advantage: the Dowding system. Think of the Dowding system like an early decentralized internet or a biological immune system. Instead of individual fighter pilots blindly patrolling the sky, Britain linked coastal radar stations, ground observers, and command centers via telephone lines. When German bombers approached, this nervous system instantly processed the data and guided British Spitfire and Hurricane pilots to the exact right coordinates to intercept them. It was a masterpiece of defensive efficiency. Winston Churchill, the newly appointed British Prime Minister, famously declared of the RAF pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." By the fall of 1940, Hitler realized he could not break the British immune system. He postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely. It was his first major strategic defeat, but instead of reconsidering his war effort, Hitler turned his eyes toward a much larger, much deadlier prize. Chapter 3. The Fatal Betrayal. To understand the deadliest theater of World War II, we have to look back at the secret deal made in Part 1, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In 1939, Hitler and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin agreed to carve up Eastern Europe and promised not to attack each other. But Hitler's entire fascist ideology was built on the concept of Lebensraum, or living space, and the absolute destruction of communism. The Non-Aggression Pact was never meant to last. It was just a temporary pause to keep Stalin asleep while Germany conquered the West. On June 22, 1941, Hitler shattered that pause. He launched Operation Barbarossa, the sudden, unprovoked invasion of the Soviet Union. It remains the largest, deadliest military invasion in the history of the human race. Over 3 million Axis troops poured across the Soviet border along a front that stretched for nearly 2,000 miles. Military historian David Glantz, one of the premier experts on the Eastern Front, has extensively detailed how the sheer scale of Barbarossa defied human comprehension. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded and annihilated in weeks. By October, German forces were on the outskirts of Moscow. The casualty figures from the Eastern Front are so massive that historians still actively debate the final toll. Estimates for Soviet military and civilian deaths range from 27 million to over 30 million people. The Eastern Front wasn't just a war. It was a war of total annihilation. But here is where the German war machine made a fatal miscalculation. They had mastered the physics of the Blitzkrieg, short, fast, devastating campaigns. But Russia is vast. Think of a military supply line like a rubber band. When an army moves fast, the rubber band stretches. In France, the distance was short enough that the band held. But as the Germans pushed hundreds of miles deep into the freezing, muddy expanses of the Soviet Union, that supply line stretched to its absolute limit. When the brutal Russian winter hit in late 1941, the German engines froze. The supply band snapped. The kinetic energy of the Blitzkrieg finally hit a wall of geographic reality. Chapter 4. The Sleeping Giant. While Europe was tearing itself apart, an entirely separate chain reaction was reaching a critical mass on the other side of the planet. The Empire of Japan had been waging a brutal war of expansion in Asia since the 1930s. But war requires resources, specifically oil and rubber. To stop Japanese aggression, the United States, which had remained strictly neutral in the global conflict, imposed a devastating oil embargo on Japan in the summer of 1941. Japan was faced with a stark choice: abandon its empire or seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia by force. They chose the latter. But Japan knew that if they expanded south, the United States Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii would easily intervene and crush them. To execute their plan, they believed they had to paralyze the American fleet in one decisive, preemptive strike. On the quiet Sunday morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The strike devastated the American battleship fleet and killed over 2,400 Americans. The next day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a stunned nation, calling it a date which will live in infamy, and asked Congress to declare war on Japan. Days later, honoring his alliance with Japan, Adolf Hitler inexplicably declared war on the United States, voluntarily bringing the greatest industrial powerhouse on Earth into the European conflict against him. Chapter 5. The Global Collision. December 1941 is the moment the timeline fundamentally shifts. The European War, the brutal struggle on the Eastern Front, and the Pacific War suddenly violently collided, fusing into one singular, all-consuming world war. The chain reaction that started with the German invasion of Poland had now dragged the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States into an alliance against the Axis powers. The momentum of the war was about to shift from a story of unstoppable fascist expansion to a grinding industrial war of attrition. The geopolitical physics of the conflict had changed. The unstoppable Spearhead had finally met an immovable object. How exactly did the Allies manage to turn the tide, push back the Axis war machine, and ultimately bring the deadliest conflict in history to a close? That is a story of unprecedented industrial production, atomic science, and unimaginable human sacrifice. If you want to see exactly how the global system was finally put back together, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a like on this video, and join us for the final chapter in Part 3.